Okay, I can see quite a few people have connected already, and it is 4 o'clock, just after 4 o'clock, so let's make a start. Welcome everyone to the seminar series of the Hague Programme on International Cybersecurity. My name is Monica Kaminska. I'm an assistant professor of international security and technology here at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Today we have the real pleasure of welcoming Andreas Krieg, who will be presenting his very recently published book called Subversion, the Strategic Weaponization of Narratives. Andreas Krieg is an associate professor in the School of Security Studies at King's College London. He's also a co-author with Jean-Marc Wickley of Surrogate Warfare and the author of 4 other acclaimed books. Outside of academia, Professor Krieg works as a geostrategic consultant at his London-based political risk firm called Mina Analytica Limited. And as I'm sure many of you know, one of the major scholarly debates in cyber conflict studies pertains to the strategic significance of cyber operations and also of information operations. And I've been reading Andreas's book, and his book addresses exactly this question. So I'm really looking forward to this talk and hearing about the main arguments of this book. So the way we'll do it is how we do it every month. Andreas will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll open up for Q&A. Please don't be shy. Feel free to ask your questions directly with your camera on. If you don't want to do that, then it's fine if you post the questions while Andreas is speaking into the chat, and I'll relay them during the Q&A session. So without any further delay, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you for having me. Great pleasure to present the book now that it's finally out. It's always bad to actually start with what I'm not going to do, because it is not necessarily a book on cyber, but it's on information operations, although it came out of research into cyber, and particularly I like the division of cyber operations into subversion and erosion of trust, and but what we're looking at is basically we're looking at subversion. We're not looking at sabotage. We're not looking at espionage as the other 2 elements of cyber. We're looking at subversion, and it's basically how you use information to mobilize or demobilize agents to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do, and doing it entirely through subversive means and information means. And if you look at these 4 images up there, all 4 of them, I would claim, are quite substantial developments and events over the last 10 years. In Egypt, it was the counter-revolution, the coup, the military coup that happened by the Egyptian military to overthrow the democratically elected government. In Berlin in 2020, we had major mobilization of masses against corona regulations, and they started to storm or try to storm the parliament, something that we saw replicated in January 2021 in Washington, the aftermath of which we're still seeing today. And then in summer of 2021, we saw something similar happening in Tunisia, where we had, similar like Egypt, we've had a mobilization of the masses to come out onto the streets to protest the government, and then kind of creating a pretext for a third party to come in and stage a coup. At this time, it was Said, kind of rolling back the achievements of the revolution. In all 4 instances, we've seen physical violence. We're seeing a major political upheaval, and all of it was basically produced through networks, information networks, kind of triggering people to change not only their attitude, but also their behavior. And taking up action against authority and potentially even changing authority structure. And much of it, or all of it, had external influence or external meddling, if you will. So in Egypt, we've had an orchestration that was done of different nodes in the information network done by the United Arab Emirates, as we've seen in Tunisia as well. In Washington, I would see the developments in Washington in January 2021 ongoing, obviously, today, and we see probably more of it during the presidential elections next year, being orchestrated, being mobilized and ripened by Russia as was the case in Berlin as well. I think Germany is probably the most problematic information environment in Europe, in the European Union at the moment, because of the deep penetration of Russian networks and intermediaries and agents and nodes in the information environment in Germany, thereby putting pressure on the political process. All four sort of developments are taking place in semi-democracies, or at the time at least were democracies where there was a degree of freedom of speech that was then usurped or exploited to kind of achieve the overall information objective. So the idea of subversion really comes from cybernetic research, which is about delivering information to the target to incline that target person or community to voluntarily make a predetermined decision desired by the initiator. Some of it has been translated as reflexive control. A lot of that research really started in the 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of it done in Russia, actually, and kind of goes back to warfare. I mean, when we talk about war, we always talk about changing our adversary's will, and that's really what subversion is all about, is achieving that changing of attitude, decision-making, and behavior solely through the means of information rather than coercion or force, as we would have seen throughout, millennia of conventional warfare. And obviously that's nothing new, but it's something that can be achieved more easily now in this hyper-connected, network-centric information environment that is mostly digital. And, in the book, I define subversion as the weaponization of information, to, again, incline target audiences collectively and individually, because sometimes we're not just about trying to mobilize communities, but we're also trying to mobilize policymakers from changing their decision-making, their attitudes, and potentially also their behavior, as we've seen with some policymakers, and kind of make them voluntarily, make them come to our predetermined desired outcome without them ever reflecting upon it. So the best information operations are probably those that are not happening through coercion, but happening through consensus, even if it is an enforced consensus. Because when you do something out of consensus, you're doing it because you believe in it, and you'll never reflect upon your actions and reflecting upon why you did what you did. So this is probably the best type of information operation you would want. And what I'm looking at in the book is three vulnerabilities that I think can be very easily exploited in the 21st century. The cognitive vulnerabilities are obviously those that are anthropologically or social psychologically, you can really trace them back throughout human history, very particular to our own cognition and our emotions and how they can be exploited. That is nothing new, but obviously because of the infrastructural vulnerabilities, and that's the infrastructure of the information environment, how we communicate, what are the means and ways that we use to communicate, they have obviously changed. And the hyperconnectivity and the unregulated manner in which information travels creates certain vulnerabilities that allow us to target the cognitive vulnerabilities of our audiences in a lot more targeted manner. And that then translates into physical vulnerabilities. That's that space of where digitally traveling information translates into physical behavior or physical action. And I think that's another very interesting element, particularly when you look at policymaking. And the way that I look at it is by looking at how civil society in particular, but also policymakers can be mobilized or demobilized in the physical space to actually change their behavior. And changing behavior can be, can lead to protest, can be mass dissidence, but it could also be an individual policymaker who steps up and changes his vote or her vote in Parliament or Congress, lawmakers changing their behavior, or even staffers who work for MPs changing their behavior, and thereby having an impact on policy discourse, changing policy discourse. And what subversion does is it taps into existing insurgencies. So it's not necessarily in itself an external meddling, but it's a degree of orchestration that's going on and ripening of what are otherwise already organically existing insurgencies. All you need to do if you're a good information warrior is basically building these networks together, connecting different nodes that might otherwise not be connected, and bring them together. Again, something that you can do in the hyper-connected digital information environment, kind of bringing like-minded people together, building echo chambers, and thereby creating an effect that leads people to kind of gravitate not only to the same narratives and ideas and worldviews, but potentially also mobilize them to basically go from the digital mobilization, digital echo chamber to a physical echo chamber where people huddle around and potentially take action on the street. And that is obviously the kind of degree of violence that is potentially very, very dangerous. On the lower end, what it translates, subversion translates obviously into influence on the lower end. It's about shaping discourse. Policymaking discourse is the most problematic one, but in any liberal democracy, civil societal discourse is equally quite problematic. And ripening dissent. And a ripening dissent can lead to a variety of different issues, as we've seen during the corona COVID-19 protests against measures taken by governments across the Western world in particular, but in Europe, we've seen quite a lot of that, but also in the United States, which were insurgencies that were organic, but the ripening of it, particularly through Russian information warriors, the orchestration element of this is what brings it from the low level of mobilization to a higher level of mobilization, and therefore having quite a lot of impact. On the higher end of it, if you look at this as a continuum, at the higher end, the upper end, you probably achieve information psychological instability. You're trying to target the very cohesion between civil society, social politics, between civil society and political authority, bringing about information paralysis where different groups within society no longer talk to one another, undermining cohesion eventually, and sowing discord between the public and political leadership. That's kind of the ultimate goal of subversion, which I would say at this point we haven't really achieved, although I would say that there are certain communities in the West that have completely disengaged already with the political process and disconnected from political authority. In Germany, I think what is quite interesting is the movement of what they call the Reichsbürger, which are people who feel disenfranchised, alienated, and no longer believe in the legality of the Federal Republic. And it's a fairly small movement, but we've obviously seen last year, was it last year or earlier this year? I think it was last year, where we've seen a couple of people being arrested for trying to stage a coup against the German government. I don't want to overstate the importance of that fairly small group of people, but we have also in the United States ever more growing groups such as this who believe in conspiracy theories, who have grievances, and who can be ripened to take action remotely, and that is kind of the audiences that we need to be very much aware of. So what subversion is, and it's always problematic in academia if you you add another definition to what is already a very convoluted sort of forest of different definitions. So I try to not do this, but I thought why I used the word subversion, because what subversion is not, it's not just public diplomacy. And it's very clear, particularly when I speak about the Gulf countries, when I talk about United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, it's not just about, engaging into lobbying and public diplomacy, putting yourself in a good light, which is essentially very defensive in nature. It goes beyond positive PR. It's very offensive in that way. It's supposed to aggressively target your opponent and opposing communities of opposing view. It's also not just strategic communication, because again, it comes at the expense of others. Strategic communication is usually fairly self-centered. It's about you talking yourself up rather than talking your opponents down. And it's also not just psychological operations, because psychological operations, in the way that it's been used most of the time, I feel, is as a force multiplier for other tactical or of other military operations. It's rarely used as a standalone lever, although everyone, and that's where subversion comes in, everyone in the 21st century over the last decade has invested into building that capability of using psychological operations as a standalone lever of power to achieve subversion. It has to be seen within the wider debate of sub-threshold warfare. I would say we're operating in that gray zone below the threshold of war, which is defined by a constant state of unpeace. So it's not these operations are not really stopping. They don't have a beginning. They don't have an end. They're constant, and we're in that competition at a constant rate. And we'll have to keep on engaging. I mean, we as Western states have to engage in that, defending ourselves, creating resilience, because it will never stop. As much as our opponents will never stop pushing this out. It's very difficult to really attribute operations to a single player because it works through networks. Information networks are heterarchically organized, they're not hierarchically organized. It means that the information warrior might just be one node of many principal nodes that lead to mobilization. And they might not necessarily be the most important ones in terms of injecting the narrative, but they're the ones that are most important in terms of orchestrating these different nodes and making them work together to kind of bring about the overall effect. And unlike coercion or compellence, subversion is not really sanctioned by international law because it's not directly violent. It's, particularly in liberal societies, it's not illegal. It's part of our, of the freedom of expression. It's cloaked in plausible deniabilities, and it's so far not considered to be an act of aggression. Although I think what is required again is one of these moments where you see how an information warrior who is an external party to your liberal information environment is trying to mobilize your society or certain communities that brings about a major disruption and major violence. Something similar to what happens on the 6th of January in 2021, but with even greater sustained pressure on the information environment. And I would say what started in the United States some 10 years ago from Russia is an ongoing process. That ripening is happening, and it's happening also because of people, individuals, communities, and nodes in the network that are not at all connected to Russia. And that's the whole point. Is not every node in the information environment is consciously a node in a Russian information network, or a conscious node of an Emirati information network or a Chinese information network. In the same way that we in the West are getting onto this as well. I mean, in the UK, we're developing similar capabilities of using it offensively, even if we're not really necessarily propagating that. But it's a way of fighting back. And the information environment, the way I look at it, is way bigger than the cyberspace. Obviously, it's both virtual and physical. It comprises virtual and physical components. It exceeds the media and social media space, so it's not just confined to the digital information environment. It's a cognitive space as well. I would say it includes academia and academic discourse, which I talk about quite a lot because I've seen it play out. I still see it play out on the Middle East. I think funding for think tanks on Middle East research has really distorted discourse and keeps on distorting discourse, making it near impossible to actually have an objective debate because information warriors are trying to shape perception. Think tanks in particular, and more than universities, think tanks are highly problematic because they're so deeply involved in trying to chase money. Policymakers and ex-policymakers who are people who leave politics. Some of them are still in politics, they can be bribed, but much of the lobbying effort is run through PR companies who hire former policymakers, all of them becoming nodes in the network. I mean, most infamously is probably a former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder being a lobbyist for Russia or Gazprom, but now also for Russia, while still having his political network behind him. All these individuals obviously being very important in the information environment. It's done very indirect, as I said, network-centric. Much of it relies on surrogates, and that's kind of the overlap with my previous research on surrogate warfare. It's all outsourced and delegated and subdelegated. And networks, if you start to unpack them, are very, very complex, which makes attribution near impossible. And ripening happens there through a variety of different means. So the coercive transactional means of ripening these nodes is obviously you throw money at it. And we see that in the UAE particularly that's what they do. They put money into, they buy people, they buy opinions. The Russians don't necessarily do that. They've done it in the past, and buying bots and trolls and making certain transactions. But it's where the Russians, and that's why I think the Russians are more dangerous, and also probably in the long run more sustainable in their approach, is what they do is they move beyond coercion and transactions into the transformational space, where they are building consensus, where you don't have to pay, where you align people who are ideologically thinking the same way. And I kind of like to give the idea of, if we look at coercion, compulsion, consensus, then we've got three a nice metaphor here. So if you want someone to go through a door, you want to influence him or her to go through a door. Coercion obviously is quite obvious. You drag someone through a door, you push them through the door, but they will never do it voluntarily. Compulsion is probably more of an incentive-driven element, where you say, if you go through the door, I give you £100 or $100. People go through it, they do it voluntarily, but still with a degree of external influence. The consensus space is, if you put the sign fire exit above a door and scream fires, people will automatically run through the fire door. I think that's kind of the space where you will, you act naturally and organically, and you will never reflect on why you do what you do. What you end up with is a death by 1,000 cuts, because it's the aggregate effect that is very difficult to deconstruct, and it's the aggregate effect that's very difficult to really attribute to one single actor. It relies on symbiotic, self-reinforcing nodes, communication nodes, and the effect that you generate is so much bigger than the sum of its parts. And that's kind of the key problem with subversion, because you can't really point the finger at one single individual or organization or state. We've done it before, and obviously there's certain nodes that are more central in the networks than other nodes. But still, it requires surrogates to basically advance the idea and take it forward. We look at information networks. Obviously, social media is quite, it's quite the obvious what they are: bots and trolls. We see more and more of it. These kind of operating in these algorithm curated environments. But it's also, your traditional media outlets, and we've seen quite a lot of that happening as well, this disintegration of the media environment, and a lot of fake journalists. And I fear that AI will have an impact on this as well, where we have more falsely generated journalists who don't exist, with fake headshots, and obviously also fake text. And just through my day-to-day Twitter experience, I feel that there's more and more of this out there, where you interact with bots, and they retweet pieces that are written by bots or by artificial intelligence, and thereby it completely meddles and muddies the information environment, making it very difficult to really create an integrated or to kind of create a good view of what is real and what is not, and what is actually authentic and what is not authentic discourse. Experts, I think, is one of these. Experts, I think, have been so far neglected in the analysis, because they seem to be just negligible nodes in the network, just in terms of the sheer number, because there aren't many think tanks, there aren't many experts in comparison to all the bots and the trolls that you have on social media. But why I think experts are very important, they are very important in all kind of lobbying efforts, is that experts can give this degree of authenticity and credibility that obviously a bot and a troll can't give you. And there are a lot of academic front groups out there, research centers that are being set up. If you look at me traditionally, well, not traditionally, but over the last 10 years or so, I've worked quite extensively in the Gulf. So I see how the Gulf countries do it. They set up their own research centers and think tanks. Nothing illegal about it, but obviously all they do is subtly, and sometimes less subtly so, kind of give credibility to particular narratives. And then there are the practitioners. The practitioners, I think, are, again, because they're outside that cyberspace, they're outside that digital space, but they also help proliferate particular narratives and bring them into the halls of policymaking and influencing policy relevant discourse. And they help translate narratives into policy agendas. And that is very problematic because all of that happens behind closed doors. The United States obviously has something like a Foreign Agent Registration Act, which we don't have in the UK, for example, or we don't have in Europe, in Brussels. If I look at Gulf countries again, if I look at Russian meddling, although Russians don't find it as easy as maybe other countries, because Russia registers in most of our minds in Europe and in the United States as an enemy or competitor. The UAE or Saudi Arabia don't necessarily, and we never really take them that seriously. But they have really subverted policymaking circles, bringing PR companies and lobbyists on board to again transport narratives from the digital space into the physical space and implanting it in policy agendas. Particularly when it comes to the UAE, obviously in the book, one of the case studies I'm looking at it is how the UAE has tried to implant the counter-revolution and the idea of the counter-revolution of all Islamists are bad, all Islamists are terrorists, pushing back against civil societal groups and the revolutions and the revolutionaries of the Arab Spring, into kind of pushing back and providing a pretext of saying the only way we will ever get stability in this part of the world is by installing strongmen, particularly strongmen in uniform, and to create some sort of authoritarian stability. These narratives have been disseminated across all their networks and then pushed into the halls of policymaking through lobbyists and PR firms. And Russia is trying to do the same, but obviously working more indirectly, particularly since the war against Ukraine started. My argument is that subversion is essentially warfare by other means, if three tests are met. Number one, it has, as you know, going back to Clausewitz, it has to serve a political end. It has to be linked to a political objective. A single troll or influencer, regardless of how influential, it doesn't matter how viral this tweet will get. If it doesn't serve a political end, it can never be a means of warfare. It has to affect real will of real human beings. So again, much of the discourse that's happening on social media these days is curated or generated by bots and trolls, so that is not organic conversation, but you need to actually affect the will of people. And the third one, it has to have a spillover effect into the physical world. It has to be violent to a degree, and political violence for me, it qualifies as violence. So if you have thousands of people marching onto Capitol Hill on the 6th of January 2021, you're kind of creating this sort of violence that, for me, in my mind, would qualify as being sufficiently violent to call it an act of war. And violence is part of that problem when we talk about information operations or cyber operations. Thomas Rid famously said that, you know, there is violence doesn't really exist in this space because it's never direct, it's always indirect. It's also very much not emotional, and you know, code in itself can never be violent. Information in itself cannot be violent. It always needs an agent to actually make it violent. But it's kind of saying, you know, if you used guns, a gun can never be violent because it always needs an agent to pull the trigger. That is true, but I would still say guns are violent and are dangerous and should be regulated. And we also should look at political violence. Extreme civil societal activism and mobilization is usually physically violence when it leads to clashes between law enforcement and protesters. And we've seen more and more of this, and more of these protests are being pushed or being at least placed in a polarizing context, and that polarizing context is created again through subversion and the information environment. So really, violence, it only ever occurs as a ripple effect. It doesn't have to be the secondary, it might be the tertiary or the fourth or fifth order effect of weaponized narratives, but it usually leads to violence, even if that link is not always a direct one, which is obviously the problematic element of it, because if you can't prove that it really emanated from that one event or action, how are you going to regulate it? How are you going to ban it? And so if we look at this sort of, you know, two of the measuring it is very difficult. And initially didn't want to go and start measuring impact of information operations because you always fail. There is no good way of measuring it. But there are two sort of continuums, I think, where I would place it on. One is measuring the level of orchestration. So to what extent actually has the outcome being orchestrated by that one information warrior? To what extent have we seen different nodes being connected by the information warrior? And the other one is the mobilization effect. How much mobilization are we achieving? Are we just looking at a bit of social media discourse, or are we actually seeing civil societal discourse outside of the digital space involving key institutions of civil society, the media, academia, and obviously at the higher end of the spectrum, policymaking discourse? To what extent are we seeing policymaking discourse being influenced? And some of that, again, the UAE were very good at. So in the UK, for example, all that lobbying and all these weaponized narratives led the Cameron government in 2015 to launch a Muslim Brotherhood investigation into an organization and into Muslim and Islamist NGOs in this country. And it led to an inquiry of kind of testing whether these are actually, whether they should be banned as terrorist organizations. All of that, obviously, that's sort of the highest impact that you could ever achieve. Probably the same is true when you look at the Trump administration. A lot of lobbying, a lot of weaponized narratives in the Trump circles in 2017 by the UAE led the US government under Trump at the time to come out and condemn and actually condone the blockade against Qatar. Again, all of that part of weaponized narratives. I would say also the Russians, probably the best thing the Russians have done in this sort of environment in terms of the highest impact of mobilization they've achieved is probably in Eastern Ukraine, kind of galvanizing and building not just a permissive environment for these secessionist groups in the Donbass, but also kind of creating them in the information environment by actually mobilizing them to take action. Again, all based on weaponized narratives. And again, I think what I did say early on is weaponized narratives don't need to be based on disinformation at all. They can be very, very factual. And I think that's another very important point. Much of when we talk about information operations or the subversion element of cyber operations, we tend to talk about disinformation and misinformation. And this goes way beyond mis and disinformation. Many weaponized narratives are actually quite factual or based on facts, or they're spins of facts. And that's the point. The point is these are the kind of storylines that get spun and that get weaponized. It's not necessarily the use of disinformation alone, because disinformation can be checked to a certain degree. Right. I think I'm not going to really talk about the different vulnerabilities because we've kind of went over that, and I don't want to go over time when it comes to this. Let me just go quickly over this. It's quite a lot on that. Yeah, a few more words on academia and expertise, because I think it is problematic, and we're all, part of the same academic think tank discourse. It is, what can you do about it? It is very difficult, because in the end of the day, we all have to seek funding, and universities, I think, are better off than think tanks, but think tanks are directly asking for funding. To what extent then we have to ask ourselves, to what extent are there strings attached when it comes to funding? And what I find, particularly when it comes to Middle Eastern studies, is that gov money doesn't necessarily always come with strings attached in terms of saying you have to become now an apologist for a particular country. But what happens is it makes you think and doubt what you say, and at times demobilizes you by keeping silent on an issue. And I think that's something that is equally quite powerful. And then there's obviously that relationship between academia, think tanks, and policymaking, as us as experts being consulted by policymakers on certain issues. And then one has to question to what extent the agenda is actually built up by one's own convictions, or to what extent it's being based on it's being built up through funding. Right. Let me skip through this. There's quite a lot on strategy as well, as like how can you strategize it. I'm not going to go through the case study here, because that will definitely go beyond that, beyond the the 40 minutes. Let me just talk about remedies and resilience, because we live in liberal information environments, and the last chapter of the book is looking at, how can we build more resilience into the system to allow us to actually bounce forward rather than bouncing backwards when it comes to sustaining these pressures being put upon our information environments. We cannot eradicate weaponized narratives, and we need to obviously kind of try to contain these vulnerabilities as much as we can, but we have to live in this hyper-connected world. And we need to be able to sustain these narratives without critically failing, without them leading to these sort of mass mobilizations or mobilizations that we've seen on the 6th of January 2021. And obviously, if you look outside of the Western world, we need to make sure that we kind of make that these mobilizations don't lead to protests and potentially revolution. We need to, cognitive vulnerabilities is where it all starts, unconscious bias training and all that sort of stuff that we do in academia needs to be part of any sort of school curriculum. Our curricula have to be adapted. We have to be better at developing counter narratives. I think the greatest weakness for us in the Western world at the moment is the West collectively and individual Western states don't have good grand strategic narratives. It's very difficult to really say what it is that we stand for. What are our values? How are we standing up for our values? And most importantly, how do we fill the say-do gaps that we still have? In particular when it comes to values, we're very inconsistent when it comes to that. There are a lot of public grievances where people feel disenfranchised. How do we address this? How do we fill these gaps? And we also need to invest more into political communication, good political communication. COVID-19 has shown how bad political messaging has been across all. I think there's a single country in the Western world that has done effectively or has done very, very well when it comes to COVID-19 and that messaging because of the level of uncertainty that we're up against. But uncertainty is just going to increase, so we need to get better at communicating around it. I also don't think that that regulation will actually lead to resilience. I think if we are liberal societies, we need to invest into self-regulatory mechanisms, particularly multi-stakeholder initiatives that bring together everyone from academia, social media companies, media companies, from government as well. But I think government should take a back seat, because the more we invest through direct government regulation, the more actually the liberal character of our information environments will get undermined. We should, the EU has made certain initiatives that have not properly been implemented. I'm talking about it in the book. And we need, unfortunately, more mediation. And that mediation, particularly in the social media space, should not come based on algorithms. And I find, without going down the whole Twitter bashing of Elon Musk, I think what we've seen, what I feel as a consumer, is that the pattern of communication has drastically changed. Twitter was, in comparison to, let's say, Instagram or Facebook, a lot less algorithm curated before. It has become immensely algorithm curated now, which makes it near impossible to actually get certain messages out if they don't fall into certain patterns and echo chambers, which is very problematic. Physical vulnerabilities, I think we have to do more in terms of targeting think tank funding, targeting funding of representatives, lawmakers in particular. The FARA Act in the United States is a good step in the right direction, but it's nearly 100 years old. It needs to be revolutionized. There's quite a lot of gray areas still and loopholes in there that need to be filled, particularly in the 21st century. But nothing like this exists in Europe, as far as I'm aware, definitely not in the UK. And also, the whole Qatargate scandal, as they called it in Brussels, showed that, what kind of swamp the whole Brussels environment is in terms of lobbying. And again, very little, there's no regulation, and it needs to be, more obvious to kind of provide, the kind of black and white sort of regulation on what is and what isn't allowed. And because at the moment, all I see is gray zone, and that is problematic. And then there's an element of resilience through deterrence. This is something the United States have tried in response to some of the Russian meddling in the information environment, pushing back by designating individuals who are involved in subversion operations and putting them on no-fly lists, sanctioning them. But beyond that, I think we need to invest into institutions. And again, that is it is slightly problematic because obviously, again, we're saying the state's supposed to manage discourse, which it isn't. But in Cold War times, the United States had the U.S. Information Agency. I think it was a way of kind of pushing narratives out that goes to in the context of great power competition. I think we need to get better at building grand strategic narratives. We had in the UK, we had the Information Research Department. Maybe there is something that can be built, something like an MI7 to build networks, information networks to advance British interests and narratives. Because at the moment, we're always on the defensive. We're never in the offensive. We're never really using the networks that we have. And we also logically need to start linking subversion attempts to acts of aggression, because what is possible now, I think we haven't seen the peak of any of that yet. I think we're just seeing the first ramifications of a longer trend. And what happens on the 6th of January is just one element of it. I think we'll see a lot more of it. What the UAE have done in Egypt, what they've done in Tunisia, what they've done in Sudan as well, they've been very, very successful in countering the revolutionary trends and civil societal movements by the people, installing creating a pretext to install authoritarians against the will of the people, again, manipulating how people think. We need to also give the tools to fight back against this to countries in the developing world. It's not just us in the West. And yeah, I leave it at that and leave some room for questions.